is this degree of systematisation based on religious foundations, religious origins. It's obviously very problematic to have freedom of thought, freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of expression, freedom of lifestyle. And what I was saying to Fires, just generally driving over, is that I remember, is it not a good thing to live in a country where there is not, and I'm not talking about this particular, but in a polity where the state kind of stays out and doesn't enforce through legislation, through the penal system, whatever, doesn't enforce a particular way of viewing the world, a particular way of behaving. There's got to be some element of legislation, but in a very I think we legislate only for what we've got to legislate for.
Yeah, absolutely.
Does that make sense?
Yeah.
The minimum to enable society to function. So 30 miles an hour is because it's in the public good. Whether you swear at your wife is not against the law. Whether you have an affair or whatever, or and I just feel that one of the things, I don't know whether this is a valid analogy, Shabir, but in Christianity, something very significant I think took place in the 16th century with Martin Luther, who moved, in a sense, his protest, he talked about the faith alone. All you need is faith. You don't need the church. You don't need the institutions and the structures of the Catholic Church. It was Luther's protest. You need to have faith. It's a personal thing. In doing that, Luther laid the foundations for secularism, the rejection of religious authorities and institutions. 500, 600 years ago, Christianity was making the same truth claims as Islam makes today, and the same degree of systematisation. But that's in a particular historical period, that's from the sort of 16th, 17th centuries, it focused less on that and more on, in a sense, individuals and what they... And I just haven't... And I'm going to ask you to edit this bit, Mohammed.
Okay.
I'm just going to, because I like you very much as a human being, and we're all human beings.
Absolutely.
There's one race, and it's the human race.
Yes. Yeah.
But I feel that's problematic in Islam. That's massively problematic. Now, you can argue about different, from a kind of phenomenological point of view, Islam is what I see.
Yeah, of course.
And do you understand what I mean?
Yes.
So I'm not learned in the different scholars of Islam, and but what I see is two things. One is intolerance and persecution.
Yes.
Another thing is some people leading double lives.
Yeah.
So saying one thing in public and another thing in private. Yeah. And that was exactly the same before 1967. In this country, people were, and I just sort of feel that this is where I'm sort of interested in this issue.
Yeah, sure.
Where does, on that issue, where does Islam stand? Because ultimately, whether you're Jewish, Christian, or there's a sense of a day of judgment, where only I am accountable for... Do you understand what I mean? And whether it's the... I try to live a good life, and what I consider and I know you're going to say it's entirely subjective, but what I consider to be a good life in the sense of making the world a slightly better place than as a result of my existence, than I'm not existing. But when Christianity is in all sorts of knots over homosexuality, I don't know how much you know about Christianity, but they're all falling out, and the American church is completely, it's kind of riven all the way down over this issue, and it's the same in England. And but to me, maybe I find that I'm a little bit scared of systems that provide answers that are just out of the, this is the answer. There's an element of, the sort of the great mystical tradition, certainly within Greek, where there's questioning is as valid as answering the questions.
Yes.
Where the questioning itself is important, not just the, and I know that some people don't consider there's divisions in Islam or Sunni and Shia, but I know in Iran, because I read in the paper yesterday that he's refusing to
Saudi Mufti.
The Hajj. He's not going to give a sort of sermon. Sort of, forgive me for using the Western language.
I know what you mean.
An address.
Because the Iranians are linked to Zoroastrianism.
He's saying that they're not Muslims, etc. Now, a few years ago, in the Guardian, there was an article. Well, they generated a petition that was ultimately fruitless, about two 16-year-olds who were hanged for homosexuality, and they had sort of hoods over their heads, and it showed them hanging, and it was an extremely, from a Western perspective, from my perspective, it was just an extremely difficult thing to swallow and to deal with. And it seems, this is why I'm asking, what about people under an Islamic polity? And I'm not talking about IS. I know that's not an Islamic polity.
Okay.
Because when you talked about that, they do this. Is that a fair characterisation?
Yeah.
You were talking about scholarship.
Yes. As I said, that if you take
very narrow. But even under mainstream Islam, if I can describe it like that, there are people who don't quite fit in. And I'm sort of interested in that, because you could say, well, if somebody steals something, then they should be punished. They don't sort of fit in if they're a thief or whatever, and I understand that, but that's a choice to behave in a certain way. But some people are the way they are without choice. It is perverse to say, well, it's a personal choice, because people wouldn't the choice of maybe rejection or alienation or being laughed at, stigmatized, whatever, beaten up. Most people within a rational mind wouldn't make such a choice. So on that question, I'm curious as to where is the, because it may be, I'm not sure, it may be portrayed as a Western disease amongst some Islamic scholars. Homosexuality, it may be portrayed as this is a Western, this is further evidence of a moribund, kind of moral decadence in the West, that this is the, but in reality that's not the case. It's probably a universal phenomenon. It almost certainly is. And I'm just asked, so I'm going to stop talking now and ask you about that issue.
You see, can I just ask, are we allowed to eat?
I'm
so glad.
I was just going to say that.
I'm so glad. While we are talking,
there's some cakes and biscuits as well if you
no
want.
problem. Okay.
I'm fasting, so you carry on.
I hope that's not too shocking.
No. Yeah, you know what? We'll get to it. Right, it's coming. It's all right.
You need to begin, or?
No.
Can I just, before you actually begin to answer that, there's something that I'm actually quite interested in. I'm sure Fayaz is, and I'm sure a lot of the viewers of TV will be interested in. Apostasy in a Sharia law, adultery, fornication, people who are not Muslims, Christians, Jews.
This is what I've been trying to talk about. I mean, the dimitude wasn't the idea of non-Muslims in Spain, for example.
It certainly isn't. Yes.
So if you can maybe address some of those as well, that would be good, because I mean, even for me and Fayaz probably, we're not, fully aware of these. So, for example, what would the state do if there was a Christian? What would he do about Jews? What would he do about apostasy, homosexuality, adultery, fornication, things like that. So even, Stephen touched on, let's say somebody who steals. Now I know that the punishment is chopping of the hand. Sounds very, very, harsh, doesn't it? But I mean, does it legislate that? And is that the only legislation on that, or?
Right. Okay.
So you're gonna have a bit to talk about there.
But first we will address what Stephen had touched on.
Okay.
Okay. Now, do you know earlier on in our conversation, I had stated that look, if the parameters are there, and somebody has only this much, the ignorance of the individual may lead to them taking a certain form of action which has not been legislated. If you can remember my words.
Yes, I do remember that.
Right. So if we were to look at the perspective about homosexuality, isn't it strange that we think, and you rightly pointed it out, many people, we'll call them Muslims, may say this is a Western disease. Okay? They may say that. But the logic is flipped here. If, for example, homosexuality is considered to be an offense, criminal or otherwise, was it referred to at the time the revelation was coming down? And if it was referred to, then it isn't a Western disease, is it? It was already mentioned. Now, history informs us that it is a practice that is thousands of years old. Number one. More importantly, if you look at what we would call certain countries that would be considered to be Islamic countries by dint of the fact that the majority of the inhabitants are Muslim.
I understand the fundamental distinction between a country with a majority Muslim, and that's not necessarily Islamic.
Exactly. Okay, but there were many countries there, where if you look at history, there were certain forms of actions which could only be construed as homosexual in nature. You have a long-standing joke about one particular country that is predominantly Muslim, where the people themselves laugh about this and say, that area is so, what you'd call, it is inhabited by people who prefer the homosexual view, okay, to the extent that if birds are flying across the territory, they would have one feather underneath as a precaution. So it's not that it wasn't touched upon. This has been happening, but the issue is not that. The issue now comes onto the overlap that we had discussed earlier on. Somebody asked me, we go to Hyde Park. We were having a discussion, and this fellow asked me, he says, Shabir, if you found out that the guy standing next to you is homosexual, what would you do? I said, well, I would turn and say hello to him. And what else? I said, I would ask him what his name is. And what else? Well, whatever is of interest that we can discuss. Now, he found it strange. He says, are you telling me, Shabir, you wouldn't attack him? I said, why would I want to do that? I said, let me tell you something. Even if it was what you consider to be a state, a country governed by the laws of Islam, I would have absolutely no authority to touch him. There is a difference between me considering something to be bad, as opposed to me trying to enforce the law of the land. If I'm not authorized to do that, I cannot do that. Touching on, do you know about how this separation of church and state occurred here or in the Western world? There is an incident just before we carry on with the subject matter, there is an incident of the Caliph. Yeah, he was the ruler of the Muslim lands. They were involved in a dispute, and he was asked to attend court. Do you know, we have the maxim here, or the principle, nobody is above the law. Yeah, and if it was Prince Philip driving too fast,
yeah,
right, I'm sorry, we are going to have to charge you. Yeah, the incident occurred, and he was called before the court, the Caliph. When he walked in, the judge decided to stand up because of the person who was walking in. And the Caliph told him, don't you dare do that. In this arena, I'm as common as everybody else. So, if you think about it, when it came to the law, it acted above and beyond what we personally would think. Okay? So, if I looked at you as an individual, and you were honest enough to tell me your position, as a Muslim, I cannot do anything to you. Yes? Now, it's a different matter where we have got lands where the governing element predominantly is Islamic law. The word Sharia, as he used, okay, if you look at it, the word itself, it actually means the way to something, the way to achieve peace. In order to do that, there are certain things which you would have to enforce. And that is what the system of law is about. Enforcing certain things. Now, it doesn't necessarily mean because I like something, I should accept. You know, you touched on it, how as an individual, I may already have concluded before I start, providing the reasoning behind my conclusion. That is true of every individual. Okay? The question therefore arises, is it better that we have got a system which is totally objective and does not take into consideration these elements that we discuss, you know, the feelings, etc. Yeah? So, if we look at homosexuality, first and foremost, we would have to look at it from the Islamic perspective, because that is what we are doing. The Islamic perspective is clear. There are certain actions which the Creator has deemed to be, for want of a better word, illegal. Okay? Homosexuality as a subject matter, is that illegal? Well, if we look at the sources and the scholarly opinion, yes, its definition can be so broad or so narrow as to make it almost irrelevant. But that's not the issue. You see, from the Islamic perspective, one of the distinctions that is made is very clear. There are certain forms of actions, sexual or otherwise, which may be prohibited. If I have a great liking for someone, and he happens to be male, and I say to someone, you know, I really love that guy, okay? That person can take whatever meaning they want out of it, okay? But there are certain things that have been legislated against. The issue here is how it is viewed amongst people and amongst states. You mentioned about those who were hanged, You look at that and you think, how could you do that to a human being?
That's my reaction,
My reaction. How could you do that? But then I would take a step back and think to myself, okay, the emotional reaction has come. I've reacted the way I think I personally felt comfortable. Okay, now can I look at the legal element? Here is where the problem lies. If something has been criminalized, do I have to agree with the element of criminality? The answer is a yes and the answer is a no. If I agree with it, I have no problem. If I disagree with it, I cannot break the law. So, if I were to take this, you know, about the hanging, you think, okay, the first and foremost thing to do as a reasonable individual is look at the sources, yes? And we, over time, have developed this system of looking at primary sources and secondary sources, yeah? Mm-hmm. If you look at the primary source from the Islamic perspective...
This is the jurisprudence.
No, that is developing the rulings behind certain statements that have been made, okay? That's the jurisprudence, okay? But if you look at the law itself, for you to be able to derive a rule, you must have something there. Otherwise you can't derive a rule. If you look at this issue, it is mentioned in the Quran about a certain people, yes, in the era of Lot. The name used, the biblical one is Lut. Yeah, okay? And it talks about how the men have lusted after the other men. That is what the description is, okay? The pleading of Lot was, look, why you, the males have been made for the females have been made for the males. Why are you transgressing that? Why are you doing something that others have never done before? Now, from a historical perspective, you want to consider it and think, oh, the statement is talking about X, yeah? Now, if we do not have the necessary evidence to prove this is what the claim that is being made is valid, and dismiss it on that basis, then we are being irrational and unreasonable. Subject to the evidence being found, or evidence that clearly proves that that could not have happened. There's a difference between proving and establishing, okay? But the statement is talking about that. It says, do not do that. And then it talks about at other places about the lust of one man to another. And it is always talking about how this is not something that the natural course of action for human beings ought to result in. So far, so good. But the primary source does not define a punishment. Now, it's odd, like I said, scholarly consensus, scholars who have put their lives into looking at this subject matter, will give you one response, as opposed to the majority of what we would call the common public, whose, in most instances, whose entire reaction is first emotional, yes, and on the basis of what they may have heard or understood, yes. Today, we are in a system where being homosexual or being lesbian or being anything other than what we consider to be the normal stance is not condemned, legally speaking. But look at the people. We still have situations where just a few days ago, okay, there was this guy giving what you would call a homophobic rant to this guy, and this guy responded accordingly. Yes? Even today, there are people who are being beaten up because they are of a certain sexuality. Now, we can say that, look, we have progressed for thousands of years and we have arrived at this stage. I would actually submit it's the other way around. Because if you go to the stage of Lot, they were practicing it then, yes? Thereafter, they were told that, look, this is not the right way, yes? There is something here you are doing which was not, we can call it, for want of a better expression, part of the plan of human beings, okay? But the point here is this, that if subsequently it may have been criminalized, and then we are reversing the process, I would submit that this is not progression,
it is regression.
It is actually regression. However, that does not necessarily mean that the human being who unfortunately or fortunately, whichever way you want to look at it, is a party to this particular kind of lifestyle, is to be outrightly condemned. Because the legal system does not clearly establish that. So, the question is this. If a person came, and we know today we have got people who may have an issue with their gender, okay, where it is not entirely clear. There's a very famous case in Canada where it happened, and they were twins. Yeah, there was a boy. There are two brothers. One of them was not what you would call normal it wasn't a normal development in terms of the gender. So this psychologist decided to do...
Did an experiment.
Yes,
Yeah.
you are aware of that one.
Yeah.
Yes? What happened to these people? Yeah? Ultimately suicide.
Yeah.
Yes? Because of the psychological
Damage.
issues and damage. Yeah? Now, the question therefore arises this. If there isn't, in the primary source, there is absolutely no punishment for a particular kind of action, not only if we say homosexuality, but the distinction now is made here. There is a thought.
Oh, yes.
There is a thought.
And an action.
There is an action. But in between, what is legislated against? Is it the thought? Is it the person being what they are? Or is it definitively the action? Well, Islamic law is clear. It is definitively the action. But then it doesn't end there. The action is one thing. Determining whether that action has occurred has got its own set of rules. Those set of rules are so stringent that it is almost impossible in the normal course of events to be able to establish the guilt of a person. But the issue is not that you are concerned about. The issue is why it is criminalized in the first instance.
One of the things which links a bit with what Mohammed said about apostasy, and this is where I have a sort of, within the Christianity, it's called canon law, which is the law of the church, which is obviously a totally different legal system to the secular state in which we live. And I think that there's maybe a historical explanation for this, because obviously through historical processes, Muslims have come live in Western countries, etc. And that has not happened in reverse to the same degree. I know there were colonial administrators,
of course,
but there's not been mass migration in the opposite direction. And what I'm sort of struggling with is when you talk about primary, secondary, it's for me the primary. Why is an Islamic state necessary? Why can't there just be? I understand. Obviously, I'm not learned in Sharia at all. But what my question is that why can't the precepts of Sharia be binding for Muslims, but why does it need to have but as a voluntary association, be with me, of people who worship at the mosque, rather than, I struggle with the idea of a state. I struggle conceptually with, as I would equally struggle with a Christian state, because I would see it as, and where I have a problem, and with a Jewish state, because it's necessarily excluded, and I don't see it as the role of the civil authorities to enforce, where there is, on a kind of epistemological level, obviously, there cannot be certainty of religious truths. Otherwise, everybody would believe them. If somebody says to me, "There's sort of poison in this, I'm not going to eat it," and if you could say, because and you prove it to me, but religious beliefs do not have that. I mean, necessarily they don't have that element of certainty. It seems to me to have it seems almost a sort of a category error to religions for me are voluntary. Now, what you'll say to me, Shabir, is I'm coming very much from a Western perspective, but I see religions as a voluntary organisations, which can have their own. As any club, a football club or the local snooker club, has its own rules, and if people infringe the rules, they are then. I do struggle with the idea of, and I know you're not talking about Pakistan state. You're talking about a kind of an ideal Islamic state, which doesn't exist in the world at the moment. and I can understand what you say in terms of the betterment of humanity and the peace. It furthers the goal of peace and kind of human well-being. But the notion of a state, sort of secular, I know that Islam doesn't even recognise these divisions, but the political class, if you will, that's what I find very alien, because I'm obviously a product of who I am, and who I am is religions here. I'm using the term loosely. Religion's here, the state is here, and thank goodness, because if we did live under a Christian state, we wouldn't be able to be doing this.
Right.
Do you know what I mean?
Right.
And there wouldn't be a mosque down the road,
Mm.
where you're sort of about 5 minutes down the road, and I think political power exercised by religious leaders or people. One of the most frightening things for me was when George Bush, President George Bush, prior to the invasion of Iraq, he said, "I've prayed about this." He actually used that, and Alistair Campbell, who was Tony Blair's press secretary at the time, Campbell said famously, "We don't do God over here."
Yeah.
And what he meant by that is that consideration didn't that sort of the considerations were strategic and militant, and I think that I'm really struggling. It's a kind of huge wall here.
Yeah.
Why do we require a state?
Yeah.
Why can't I'm not saying Turkey but Kemal Ataturk wanted a secular state, didn't he?
Yes.
Which obviously would be predominantly the people living in Turkey are Muslim, but the state is not a branch, an arm, if you will, to enforce that. And I think that's one of the things that I struggle with, the notion of, and it's obviously because Western, the history of Christianity is so different. For me, a Christian state would be, I'd want to run a mile from it, although I am Christian in that.
I see.
I don't
what you
want
mean.
that.
Yes.
I do not want to. In France, I was utterly appalled, and the banning the burqa for me is, in a liberal society, is a profoundly illiberal act. Now the French could argue, well, this is the law. And, to me, the state is there to ensure our well-being. Religion it's not there to enforce religion. And it's not there to enforce, can I use the term, an ideology? Whether it's an ideology of secularism, whether it's an ideology of Islam or Christianity. I'm very, very, I have a massive mental block. Why do we need, you can have a country that's populated predominantly by Muslims, but why do we need an Islamic state?
I think the approach here, and I entirely agree with your sentiments. However, if we look at it this way, if off the top of our heads, how many laws are on the statute book in the United Kingdom?
Thousands and thousands.
You got it right.
Many obsolete now. Sure.
Thousands and thousands. And you know what? And you touched on it. Many are obsolete, but you know what? There are so many that are not. And if you were to invoke them, you'd cause havoc. But the point is this: are you familiar with all those thousands and thousands?
No.
I don't think 99.9% of us are. Even the people who work in the legal system will not be aware. Okay? But now, if we were to look at them, does that necessarily mean that it may denigrate the way we look at the system, or it may enhance the way we look at the system? Now, if I were to take the question that you have posed, why an Islamic state? A scholar was asked, he said, if you look at the world today, which one do you think is running according to what Islam has said? Which one is the one that you can point out and say, you know what, this is the closest to an Islamic state? Do you know which one he pointed out? The United Kingdom. Now, isn't that a surprise? Well, Why isn't it Saudi Arabia or somebody? Yeah? But you see, the difference here is this, as I mentioned. Okay? If you look at the system, address the system the way the system is, and not because of our prejudices, our ideas, yes, you will find that any human being who is told, look, we want a system that is the best for all peoples concerned, yeah? Nobody will disagree with that. Then we will come to what we call the nitty-gritties, and we might have discussions over it, okay? Now, what does an Islamic state constitute, okay? The first thing that people think is, chopping hands, hanging people. Actually, no, that is not the case.
I don't have that prejudice.
Of course you don't. I appreciate that. Yeah, but if you look at it this way, Stephen, if I ask, in normal circumstances, you ask Muslims, okay, in the Quran, how many criminal offenses have been legislated, and how many punishments have actually been instituted and mentioned in the Quran? You know, when you said that the less the better, yeah, the Quran has mentioned, according to most scholars, 4 offenses only. How many? 4. There are some scholars who include 2 others, okay? One of them being apostasy, and one of them being alcohol. But if you look at the Quran, these 2 do not have a specific punishment. So how many are there in grand total? 4, okay? You think to yourself, wait a minute, one of them is theft, that he mentioned, okay? And in the Quran, yeah, it talks about what happens to certain people if they steal. It says to the male, to the thief, male and female, if they steal, chop the hand off. Now it seems abhorrent that you would do something like that. Here is the logic. If the person out of desperation stole, and you amputated his hand, then if he was in a bad position, he's now going to be in a worse position.
Yeah.
Now, is that what legislation is for? Well, the answer would be a strict no.
The reformation of character cannot.
Number 1, yes, but it's not only that. You see, the problem here is this confusion between how people who in normal circumstances, and I'm alluding to the legal system here just for a minute, yes, if I went into a court of law, okay, and the judge says, and you are, I said, I'm Shabir Yusuf, okay, are you representing X? Yes, I am, okay. After a few minutes, he asks, Mr. Yusuf, do you have rights of audience? Yes, I do. Okay. Now he has seen something in what I have done or said, which is not normal for legal representatives. So he has asked me, do I have a right of audience? And I said yes. But he's still not satisfied. So he asks me, okay, can you please tell us your registration number? Whatever it may be.
I understand that.
Yeah. Now, you will note that if I am found not to satisfy the criteria, I will be told, I'm sorry, you cannot represent him, please leave. Question is why? Because they have a procedural system. That system, unless you are aware of it, may lead to injustice being perpetrated because you did not effectively handle the case. Okay? But it's not only that. There's a legal system now. That legal system tells you what it can impose on you. It is all apparent. It is straight. Yeah? But if somebody is accused of a crime, as we were just discussing earlier on, and they go in, or they are charged, that charge is going to be based on statute. Yes? If it says this is what constitutes murder, you will be charged with it. Now, there is a process of investigation, a process of collating evidence, etc. We all know that. Now, the Islamic system is pretty much the same. Not pretty much. In fact, I would submit